Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first session of the workshop African Philosophy in the 20th Century, Historical Materialism or Ethnophilosophy with Zeyad and Nabolsy. Today, voices like Cedric Robinson and his followers advocate for the existence of an African metaphysics as an alternative theoretical orientation for emancipatory projects, challenging historical materialism. However, this contention isn't new. It dates back to the mid-20th century when African philosophy emerged as an academic subfield. It is also subjected to criticism from a historical materialism perspective by Paulin Hountondji. This workshop revisits this debate and explores its current relevance. Our readings will focus on two texts by Beninois philosopher Paulin J. Hountondji. The first one is African Philosophy, Myth and Reality, and the second one is The Struggle for Meaning, Reflection on Philosophy, Culture and Democracy in Africa. Hountondji's work is interesting for a variety of reasons, but his most important contribution, at least for the purposes of this workshop, has to do with his claim that a certain way of doing African philosophy, what he labels ethnophilosophy, is liable to impede development of the African continent through mystification. I will critically assess his arguments in support of this claim and try to reconstruct and evaluate the positive proposal of him, which gives a rather deflationary account of the role of philosophy in development and political movements more generally. Session 1, titled Origins of the Debate, will start with a text that has been the subject of controversy in African philosophy from 1945 onwards. Namely Placide Tempel's Bantu Philosophy. Tempel's book was positively received by key African philosophers and politicians such as Leopold Sédar Senghor and Alain Diop. We examine how Temples presents Bantu ontology and what the implications are for debates about African alternatives to historical materialism. Session 2, titled The Critique of Ethnophilosophy, introduces Paulin Hountondji's critique of ethnophilosophy through the first part of his book, African Philosophy, Myth and Reality. Hountondji contends that Temple's approach to African philosophy is liable to mislead both Africans and Europeans. Hountondji tries to show how ethnophilosophy can be critically assessed on philosophical terms and then explained in sociological terms. Session 3, titled Nkrumah and the Shadow of Ethnophilosophy. Kwame Nkrumah championed a national development campaign in Ghana and produced a philosophical discourse to legitimate it. The key text in this philosophical discourse is his conscientism. Hountondji contends that the African socialism that Nkrumah champions in this text is yet another iteration of ethnophilosophy. The final session, The Place of Marxism in African Philosophy, will study Hountondji's work, The Struggle for Meaning, Reflections on Philosophy, Culture, and Democracy in Africa, to understand how his critique of ethnophilosophy was driven by a commitment to a Marxist political cause. We'll investigate the nature of this project and its bearing on debates about development and emancipation of the African continent today. Zeyad Nabolsy earned his bachelor in chemical engineering and master of arts in philosophy from McMaster University, and a PhD in Africana studies, particularly African philosophy, from Cornell University. He specializes in the history of Africana philosophy with a focus on modern African philosophy. He has previously published on Amilcar Cabral's Philosophy of Culture, methodological debates on racism and ideology in the historiography of philosophy. Olaudah Equiano, as a philosopher, classical German philosophy such as Hegelian and Kantian philosophies, Paulin Hountondji's Philosophy of Science, modern African political and social philosophy with a focus on African Marxism and their relation to African literature, and ancient Egyptian philosophy. He's currently working on a comparative intellectual history of 19th century African philosophy with a focus on West African James Africanus Bill Horton and Egyptian رفاعة التختاوي. Zeyad, please take it away from here.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for being here. So I'm going to start talking about the reading for today, which is really setting us up for the discussion that's going to be focused on Paulin Hountondji and his critique of ethnophilosophy. But of course, before launching into the study of the critique of ethnophilosophy at the end of Paulin Hountondji, we really have to understand what's ethnophilosophy. And the paradigmatic case of ethnophilosophy, the case that provided the sort of model that people followed, was Placide Tempels' book Bantu Philosophy. So we read a part of Bantu Philosophy for today. So Bantu Philosophy, it's first published in 1945. So originally, Placide Tempels, he's a Belgian missionary working in what is today the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo. He is working amongst the Baluba people. I mean, he never really talks specifically about the Baluba or Luba people. Sometimes they're called Luba. He talks about Bantu people, so all speakers of Bantu languages. So we'll get to why that's important to track. Now, what he does is he spends a couple of decades there and he's learning their language, and he's essentially, functioning as a kind of ethnographer. Now, that's not really that surprising, since a lot of missionaries also took on the task or function of ethnographers of the people amongst whom they were working. What's especially interesting about Placide Tempels is that he's writing these kind of notes for himself, trying to understand how best to evangelize the local population that he's living amongst. And he discovers, according to him, right, he gives us an account in the beginning of Bantu Philosophy, that in order to successfully Christianize these people, you have to understand their deeper philosophical commitments. Otherwise, you won't understand their objections to certain practices or their objections to attempts by the missionaries to get them to give up certain practices. We'll go into detail to talk about that. But so this book is first published in 1945. He's writing it in Flemish, so in a dialect of Dutch, right? And then but it gets published in a French translation. But then interesting, so it's being published in the Congo, right? But then interestingly, it gets picked up by one of the most influential African publishing houses in 1948, I want to say. I might be a bit wrong about the dates, but that's fine. Google is there, we can sort it out. So Présence Africaine, which is this very important publisher based in Paris, still existing today, takes up this book and publishes it. And then in 1959, there is an English translation. So the translation we're reading is this 1959 translation. And in the circle around Présence Africaine, this book is really celebrated. So why is it being celebrated? Well, we have to understand the historical context. And one thing to note is that Placide Tempels in the book, and he's pretty explicit about this, right? He says it's simply wrong to say that these people, he sometimes calls them primitive people, but he doesn't seem to mean that in some kind of derogatory sense, although it's a bit complicated. But he says, look, the thesis that these people think illogically or without logic is simply false. Now, what's he talking about here? So, in the early part of the 20th century, you had Lucien Lévy-Bruhl, who's a French philosopher, who writes books about what he calls the primitive mentality. Right, so that's what he studies, and the primitive mentality is supposed to, be a kind of catch-all term that refers to the mental outlook of not just Africans, but for example, Micronesians, indigenous peoples in the Americas, right, and so on, the Maori, right. So he's drawing on all of this ethnographic evidence, also evidence drawn from fieldwork by British anthropologists in Australia, right? So, and he synthesizes this evidence and he says, well, look, there is a kind of general primitive outlook, if you will, primitive mentality. And this primitive mentality is characterized by, well, several features, but the feature that matters really for us to understand what Placide Tempels is doing is Lévi-Broul's claim that it's characterized by being illogical, in the sense that it doesn't subscribe to, for example, the laws of classical logic, so doesn't subscribe to the principle of non-contradiction. It doesn't ascribe to the law of excluded middle, right? So the principle of non-contradiction just says, a proposition P can be both true and false at the same time. The principle of excluded middle says that every proposition is either true or false, right? There is no intermediate value between truth and falsehood. And he says this mentality just doesn't abide by these laws. Now, Placide Tempels comes and says, well, actually, that's just not true at all. And he says in several parts of the text, as I'm sure you've noticed, that, it's not true that these people are lacking in logic. I think he says that explicitly, or are illogical, right? So that's one angle. That's one of the things that Placide Tempels is criticizing, one of the intellectual currents. Sorry. The other intellectual current, which is older, of course, but it claims that, look, so-called primitive peoples don't really have abstract thought at all, regardless of whether it's logical or illogical. Therefore, you cannot find anything that approximates philosophy amongst these people. And Placide Tempels says, well, actually, the relevant ethnographic evidence, according to him, according to his own investigations, shows that this is false. Now, Placide Tempels, says explicitly, look, to say that so-called primitive people don't possess a system of thought is to claim that they are not fully human, right? And he rejects that. So you can see in this context how Placide Tempels' book would be received positively by African intellectuals such as Leopold Sédar Senghor, who was already mentioned in the introduction, right? Because Placide Tempels is arguing against these denigrating discourses on Africans. Okay. But who is this book being addressed to, right? So primarily, if you think about the primary audience of Bantu philosophy, and this becomes important for Paulin Hountondji's critique, which we get to next week. So there are several audiences for this book. So the book is pretty explicitly written in response to the needs of colonial officials to better understand their subjects, right? This is pretty clear. And this becomes an acute need, or it's a need that's acutely felt because there are rebellions in the Belgian Congo in the 1930s and 40s, right? So there is a notion that, well, actually, maybe that some more adequate knowledge of the people we govern would be helpful so that we avoid these revolts, because, of course, they're very expensive to put down, right? You have to feed an army and you have to move it around and so on, and it disrupts the exploitation of primary resources, right? It's pretty obvious why you wouldn't want to have these revolts. So there is that need. As I mentioned earlier, Placide Tempels himself, he's deeply committed to his task as a missionary. So, of course, there is a kind of missiological or a need based on this missionary endeavor to understand these people so that, one could then avoid this phenomenon which Placide Tempels described, whereby you have seemingly successful attempts at the Christianization of African subjects in the Congo, But Placide Temples says, well, look, there is a sense in which this Christianization is very superficial, in the sense that in moments of crisis, we see these people, they revert back to their tradition, to what Placide Temples takes to be their traditional beliefs, right? So in matters of life and death and so on, they then appeal to this ontology of forces, which we're going to talk about, right? So they're not really, they go to church and they play the part, they dress the part, but they're not really deeply committed Christians, and he's upset by that. And Placide Temples' own approach to missionary work, based on Bantu philosophy, seems to be assuming that, well, look, you can't really just denigrate all aspects of the customs, institutions, and beliefs of the people you're trying to convert, because you have to have a realistic understanding of these customs and maybe their functional role in these societies, and whether some of them are not really just compatible with Christianity, and therefore they should be left alone, right? So there is already an attempt to, which is not very explicit in Temples, but you see it, of course, much later with, especially with Christian African theologians, who will say, well, look, okay, we're Christians, we're committed to Christianity, obviously. We want to get other people to see the light, to become Christians again. That's pretty obvious, right? If you're committed to Christianity, you'd be committed to that. But they say we have to distinguish between Christianization and Westernization, right? So what is really essential to being a Christian versus, what is a kind of accidental aspect of Christianity as it developed in the West, and that maybe is not essential for someone to take up in order to become a Christian. But that's an area of debate, of course, that develops over time. One key thing that Placide Temple seems to be really committed to is this view that really all societies were originally monotheistic societies, right? He says that in the beginning of Bantu philosophy. And that this monotheism degenerated over time. And therefore, when you see people practicing things such as what Placide Temples would describe as, say, ancestor worship, or talking about and worshipping, say, the spirit of the river or the spirit of the forest, and so on, right? So some of these animist beliefs, he thinks that this is a degeneration from a kind of original monotheism. And this is a kind of common move made by missionaries, Christian missionaries, since, at least I want to say the 16th or 17th century, which is to say, well, look, there is a sense in which all people already accept the idea that there is a supreme being. What we need to do as missionaries is to just clarify to them what they themselves already implicitly believe, right? So that it's not really a radical break with what these people say. This is animated by all sorts of worries. So the original theological worry comes from this discussion in the 15th century of the question of, well, look, Europeans discovered the seemingly new world, right, with Columbus and so on. And a question arose as to what happens to those people, in the new world, given the fact that they don't seem to have received any profits, right? So you've had, generations of these people living and dying without receiving the truth. And the question became, in theological terms, whether there is any justification for these people to suffer in the afterlife, given that they didn't receive the message, so they didn't have a chance to reject it or accept it, right? So and one response to that was to say, well, actually, they probably already received prophets and so on, so they've had some kind of access to historical revelation, and the evidence that's adduced for that is to redescribe these religions as a kind of degenerated monotheism, and to say, well, look, they seem to have had some kind of belief in monotheism, which degenerated over time. So you just need to, uh, uh, purify this belief and sort of help them see that they should get rid of beliefs in spirits and all of that stuff. Okay, so there is a longer history here. That's we don't need to go into more detail. I don't think so. Now, Placide temples. So what I want to focus on here really is the methodological moves that he makes, because this will be the focus of Paulin Hountondji's criticism of ethnophilosophy. But before I do that, actually, let me say something about ethnophilosophy. So ethnophilosophy itself, as a word, it's an exonym. And by that, I just mean it's not a name that the people who do ethnophilosophy gave to themselves. It's a name given to them by their critics. And the most famous critic is Paulin Hountondji. There is also another, there's a Cameroonian philosopher as well, Marcian Tois, who played a very important role in this debate. Unfortunately, we don't have time to read his work, but if people are interested, Marcian Tois is important as well, right? So it's an acronym. People who wrote books that Paulin Hountondji would consider to be ethnophilosophical books would not themselves say, would not describe themselves as ethnophilosophers. So, of course, there is a sense in which Placide Tempels is engaging in some kind of ethnographic endeavor, and he concedes that, but he wants to emphasize that he's doing something a bit different. And you'll notice the passage where he says, ethnology or ethnography. I can't remember if he uses ethnology or ethnography, but anyway, he says, I think it's ethnology. Ethnology is just folklore without a philosophical basis. So if you don't have a philosophical basis, if you don't have a philosophical understanding of the practices of the people that you're trying to study, as it were, then you're just collecting, some folkloric information, which might be interesting, but who cares? If you have a list of folkloric elements and say, okay, look, these people, they eat this, they dance like this, they listen to this music, Placide Temple says, okay, and fine, and what follows from that? Placide Temple seems to be committed to the claim that these ethnological discourses are given unity and they're given an adequate scientific status once you understand the basic philosophical framing that allows you to make sense of these behaviors, right? What do these people fundamentally believe about the nature of reality such that they behave in this way? Now, this goes to a core assumption that Paulin Hountondji makes, which we can think about. And when we get to this discussion portion of this session, I think we should attend to it. So Paulin Hountondji, Placide Tempels seems to be assuming that systematic, consistent human behavior has to be based on what Placide Tempels explicitly calls a complete philosophy of the universe. This seems like it's a reasonable assumption, but of course it can be challenged. Someone could say, well, look, is it really true that in order to explain the behavior of a group of people, I have to appeal to what they believe about the fundamental nature of reality? Somebody could say, look, the common sense view perhaps is that most people don't have don't have explicit beliefs about the fundamental nature of reality. So for example, you might say, why assume that the average person going about their day has some kind of implicit philosophical assumption about the nature of space and time? Maybe they just don't think about it. Maybe they don't. And maybe there is no sense in which you could say there is some kind of implicit belief. And we'll go into, thinking about what it means to talk about an implicit as opposed to an explicit belief, right? Because Placide Tempels, he's aware of some methodological problems here. And he says, look, it's not like people will come and tell you, oh, here is my fundamental views about the nature of reality. Most people maybe don't care about this. But he says the way they talk presupposes a certain conception of reality. Now, there is a key point to be had here, right, to be emphasized here. Namely, that it seems a bit tricky, and Paulin Hountondji will raise this as an objection. It's a bit tricky to go from what people believe, right? So let's say, I have beliefs X, Y, and Z, whatever those beliefs are. And let's say you study these beliefs and say, well, look, if you believe X, Y, and Z, then you should also believe this other thing, P, whatever P is, right? And from the standpoint of discussing logical entailment, you could say, maybe that's assuming you're right? So in fact, somebody who believes X, Y, and Z has to believe P, whatever P is. But to go from the fact that I have beliefs that entail another belief, to then go from that and say, well, actually, there is a sense in which I implicitly hold the belief P, that seems problematic, right? Because, well, for a variety of reasons, of course. So, but the main reason would be that, first of all, we're not logically infallible machines, right? I have beliefs that probably contradict one another, as does everyone in this session, almost certainly. And that's why when we go and have a discussion or dialogue, it's totally normal for me to say, oh, I thought, I could believe X and Y, but you showed me if I believe X, I cannot also consistently believe Y, right? That's something we do. So one thing you could say about Placide Temple's methodological approach, if you're thinking about this, in terms of what a critic could say to Placide Temple's, is that there's a problem of underdetermination here, right? So from the beliefs that people explicitly hold, it's very hard to say, well, they also hold these other beliefs that they don't explicitly hold. What you could say is that they ought to hold these beliefs. But then you're making a normative claim. You're saying they should do this, not that they actually do this. And I'll give you an example of where this difference, between the normative and the descriptive really becomes very important. So let's take an example of somebody like, who am I thinking of? Let's take the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution and all of these debates about them, and let's take someone like Toussaint Louverture, who writes to the metropolis, to people who have signed the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and says, here is what you've committed yourself to. This is incompatible with slavery, and therefore you're falling into contradiction. So what's your solution? Assuming that Louverture is right, your solution is to say, well, actually, I'm not really serious about the rights of man. Okay, I was just joking, or to say, no, you're right that, slavery is incompatible with the Declaration of the Rights of Man. But it would be very hard for me to say that because you believe in the Declaration of the Rights of Man, then you believe that slavery in the Caribbean is not normatively justified. At most, what I could do, as Louverture does, is to say that you ought not to believe that slavery in the French Caribbean is justified or should be upheld, right? So it's that differentiation between the descriptive and the normative that becomes really important, because, of course, Placide Temples himself, he says pretty explicitly that what he is doing here is primarily a descriptive project. So towards the end of the reading for the session, he says, and this is a direct quote, we have only set down the understanding of the common man, so the common Luba man, or Bantu man, because Placide Temples thinks he can generalize to talk about all speakers of Bantu languages. So Bantu languages are a family of languages. Placid Temples is studying the speakers of a particular member of that family of languages, the Luba people who live in sort of what's today the south central part of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, but he thinks he can generalize from that. And then that's why you see he has references to people who, whether colonial officials or other missionaries working in different parts of the African continent with other speakers of Bantu languages who say, oh, what you're saying here kind of matches with our experience. And he thinks he can kind of build up a case for this generality claim that way. Anyway, but that's so this notion that he's just setting out the common wisdom or common understanding of the average person in that society. That's a claim to be engaged in a descriptive endeavor, right? He's not saying that I'm saying that this is what the average man ought to believe in this society, given more fundamental beliefs that they're committed to. It's like this is actually what they believe, right? So this is a claim that when you think about it, it requires a bit of evidence to really support it, to get us to be on board with it. Now, and you'll see also in the beginning of the text, there is a claim to the effect that maybe what's being said here about this ontology of vital forces applies to lots of societies, even beyond the African continent, right? So there is a commitment to a descriptive generalization here. Now, how does Placid Temples try to identify Bantu philosophy? So in the methodological section, which is sort of the first part of the reading, he says, okay, so we study their language, their customs, and their institutions. This is our data, if you will. And the hierarchy of vital forces is essentially our hypothesis. This is what's supposed to make sense of that data. And then if there are anomalies between what's entailed by this hypothesis, namely that these people believe in this dynamic ontology of vital forces that are hierarchically organized, if there is an anomaly, then we have to account for that. Now, we could say that this is fine. This is not, it's not an absurd claim to make. But there are issues that arise when we start thinking about this. So take, for example, the question of how to explain human behavior, right? Very simply, in a very abstract sense. So, of course, one way in which we explain human behavior is to appeal to how people, fundamentally see the world, what they sincerely believe about the world. That's fine, right? That seems plausible. So why is Zeyad participating in this ritual? Because Zeyad sincerely believes that there is a spirit, and that the spirit needs to be given tribute or something like that, so that our community, flourishes. Whatever, right? Okay, that's fine. But there is another way in which we can explain human behavior by appealing to what people, of course, still appealing to what they believe, right? But to, what they believe, for example, about social pressures to conform, right? So one way to explain why somebody goes to the church on Sundays to say they believe in whatever it is that they're supposed to sincerely believe in that case. Another explanation is to say, well, they do understand, or they believe that there is a social cost to pay if you don't attend. And then, of course, in that case, our explanation has nothing to do with, their metaphysical beliefs about a god or about a transcendent deity, whatever. We're referring to their beliefs about, the existing social hierarchy, their place in it, right? So these are complete models of explanation. And someone could say it's a bit naive to say that all people who are participating in, some of these rituals are participating because they actually believe in this, in, the importance of the ancestors or something like that. Of course, some of them probably do, but some of them don't probably. And of course, this is compounded by the fact, and why does this matter? Because someone could say one problem with what Placide Tempels is saying here, regardless of the content of the view, right? Regardless of what we think about this ontology of vital forces. But someone could say, well, look, the fundamental problem is that he's assuming a kind of unanimity that seems totally unrealistic, right? So is it the case that all these people that he's studying, they really fundamentally don't disagree about the nature of reality? I mean, that seems totally bizarre. Why does it seem totally bizarre? Because someone could say, well, look, when we're talking about philosophy in any other context, Indian philosophy, Chinese philosophy, Greek philosophy, what we're talking about is we're fundamentally talking about disagreements. It'd be very hard to envision a philosophical discourse where everybody just agrees with everyone else. And, there wouldn't really be a kind of dialectic in the sense of a discourse where, I'm affirming a thesis and you're pointing out problems with my account, so I try to modify it and so on, right? So someone could say this is a totally unrealistic view of these societies, and that it's perhaps playing into a form of primitivist discourse, right? So you have these so-called primitive societies that are not, really socially differentiated to a degree that would allow for important differences to arise between them, between members of that society. But someone could be skeptical about that. And the other issue, of course, when we're talking about unanimity and dissent and all of that, is we have to recognize, someone could say, that when you're studying a society that's primarily an oral society, right? So literacy is not widespread, perhaps literacy is inaccessible for most people. It's a bit difficult for dissenting beliefs to survive, right? Because the only way for a belief to survive in an oral society is for it to be communicated, well, orally to someone. So let's say, I go sit through the rituals in my society and I'm thinking to myself, what kind of, nonsense is this, right? Probably in every human society, someone sat through a ritual and thought, okay, this is totally nonsensical. But, they might have had really good prudential reasons for why they didn't, say that out loud, raise their hand and said, I don't really believe in what you guys are saying. But the only way that these dissenting beliefs can survive, right, seems to be through oral communication. But of course, in an oral culture, you might think that the dissenting view will not really survive for very long in historical memory. Maybe because people are, the people who know of this view are afraid to share it. They don't want to share it with others. So in a sense, this, the track record of the beliefs that obtained in that society might be altered. Whereas, of course, we have cases where the existence of a written record prevented attempts to totally wipe out the memory of the existence of the dissenting view. So I'll give you an example. If you think about ancient Egyptian religion, for example, in the New Kingdom, you might have heard of Akhenaten and his, proto-monotheistic attempt to impose the worship of the sun disk Aten on Egypt. Now, what's really interesting, of course, we won't go into the details, but what's really interesting is naturally the priests of Thebes who were benefiting from uh, 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 the old religious order, if you will, they were deeply resentful of this change. And indeed, Akhenaten, there was an attempt to wipe out the memory of Akhenaten from Egyptian history. So you'll see inscriptions where it's clear that somebody tried to remove all references to him and to his religion, Aten of the sun disk. But, that person was not that successful because we still obviously have some of these inscriptions and so on. But that's a case where, okay, think of something like that happening in a society without writing. It's totally conceivable that, the record of this dissenting religious view would have been totally, blotted from memory, from the historical record, right? So that's a case where, again, someone could say to temples, okay, this view that there is a kind of Bantu philosophy that all speakers of Bantu languages adhere to. Maybe if, we're being charitable, we'll say, okay, maybe it picks out some hegemonic views in that society. But perhaps it's too rash to claim that it picks out a view that everyone in that society assents to. Right. So that's something we can think about in terms of, methodologically what's happening there. Now, interestingly, again, focusing on the methodological questions, Placide Temple says very explicitly that, look, if you go and talk to one of the people who live in that society that I'm describing, they will not be able to give you an explicit articulation of their ontology in the same way that I'm doing now. So I'm articulating it explicitly on their behalf, right? So that's one of his more contentious claims. Because once he says that, of course, some people raise the question of, okay, to what extent are you recording their views, and to what extent are you foisting beliefs upon them that they don't actually believe? Right? Once I'm saying, well, look, they can't really systematically articulate their philosophical convictions. So I will do it on their behalf. But once I do it, they will be able to recognize themselves or their beliefs in the system that I've articulated. Right? That's the key move that he makes. Now, one interesting thing to highlight, again, methodologically, is how Placide Temples thinks of philosophy itself. So his core metaphilosophical convictions. Placide Temples very clearly thinks that the core of philosophy is ontology. The core of philosophy is a theoretical discourse on what exists, what is. And this is why, for him, Bantu philosophy is fundamentally Bantu in ontology. Now, again, think about that. This is not an uncontroversial claim. Someone could say, wait, why do you think that the core of philosophy is ontology? What if I'm someone like Paulin Hountondji, for example, would say, what if I'm someone who, is a Kantian, who thinks that ontology, taken in the sense of this rationalist metaphysics, where we start from definitions and then axioms, and then we try to build up an account of what exists in general terms using deductive arguments. Maybe I'm someone who thinks that this doesn't really work. And maybe I'm someone, so if I'm a Kantian, maybe I think epistemology or the theory of knowledge is really what is at the heart or core of philosophy, right? So there might be, again, metaphilosophical disagreement here uh, or a metaphilosophical objection that someone could raise when reading Bantu philosophy. Okay, so I really wanted to focus on the methodological stuff in this lecture, and we'll have time to discuss. But before doing that, just very briefly, I'm going to say something about, well, okay, what is this Bantu ontology or Bantu metaphysics that, Placide Tempels purports to describe? Well, so Placide Tempels makes this juxtaposition between a static conception of being, which he attributes to Western philosophy, which particularly he attributes to Western philosophy as influenced by Aristotelianism and Neo-Aristotelianism, right? So you have this notion of substance and it has properties, uh, uh, and these properties can change, but the substance remains, it's a kind of underlying substratum, you know. And he thinks that this is a conception of being that's primarily static. So, force would be a property of a substance, uh, but it's not identical to the substance, not identical to being as substance. Now, the reason that Placide Tempels thinks of Western philosophy in this way is Placide Tempels probably had a new Aristotelian Thomistic education. Almost certainly he did, actually, not probably. So this is really what he understands by philosophy. It's the kind of synthesis between Aristotelian philosophy and Christian commitments that characterize Thomistic philosophy. This is what Placide Tempels thinks philosophy really is, Western philosophy at any rate. And he juxtaposes that, static conception of being in Western philosophy to what he takes to be the dynamic conception of being, which animates Bantu philosophy. And he says that in Bantu philosophy, force is being and being is force, right? So force is not a property of being, force is identical to being. Force is, a being is just force. That's what it is. So that's a fundamental juxtaposition. And he says, well, look, according to this view, forces or beings, right, they're the same thing, can become greater or they can be diminished. Now, he says that this is supposed to make sense of the way that the Luba speak of certain practices, the way the Luba speak of their themselves being diminished, or the way they also speak of themselves as experiencing an increase in their power, an increase in their being, if you will. So, and this notion of the possibility of increase and diminishment, I mean, it's, of course, applied to forces here, it makes some kind of intuitive sense. But, early modern European philosophers like Descartes, for example, they'll talk about things that have more being than other things or more reality than other things, right? So, anyway, that's also say, this is probably what Placide Tempels is drawing on in terms of, maybe his education and so on. Mind you, of course, he's not a professional philosopher, right? I mean, I don't mean this in the sense of that he's a bad or a good philosopher, but he, doesn't earn his living by teaching philosophy. He's a missionary. Now, one of the other claims that Placide Tempels makes is that there is a hierarchy of power or a hierarchy of forces in this Bantu philosophy. So first, you have God, the supreme being. Remember that on this view, really, he's describing Bantu religion as essentially a form of monotheism that just needs to be readjusted. And we need to get rid of all of these things that have accrued as a result of degeneration over time. Right, so what's the hierarchy? It's God, the first ancestors of the various social divisions, right? The kind of heroes, mythological heroes, in the same way that, the ancient Greeks would talk about the founders of their cities, right? He says so. You have these originary ancestors. And then going in descending order, you have the more immediate ancestors, so our own, the society's own living, ancestors who, let's say, passed away within living memory. And then you have living human beings who occupy kind of elevated social political positions. So I believe he calls them chiefs, right? And then, of course, you have, regular people in the group. And then going further in descending order, you have animals, and then you have plants, and then you have minerals, right? So this is the hierarchy of power, basically sketched out in descending order. And he says, if you observe the practices and beliefs of these people, that you could see that this is an anthropocentric worldview, which of course he doesn't mean anthropocentric in a critical sense, right? I mean, for him, an anthropocentric account is probably a common sense account. It's, he's actually trying to make it somewhat close to what he thinks his Christian readers believe, right? So he says on this view, basically, God made lesser beings like animals so that humans can use them to strengthen their vital forces. So, of course, one obvious way in which we, do this is, killing and consuming these animals, right? So that increases our vital force. Which is, I mean, one thing to remark here, Placide Tempels gives us some observations, some of the data, but he doesn't really give us a lot of the data. So, and that's one of the criticisms that people will level at him, that, we don't have enough of the data to put it bluntly, to see if whether, what he posits makes sense as a hypothesis, is plausible, or whether, it doesn't really fit the data, right? So that's the other issue that becomes clear here. So going further in terms of describing this worldview, now Placide Tempels, some of you probably noticed, and this is where things get very interesting and tricky, right? He inserts the white man in this hierarchy of forces, right? So he says, well, look, where is the white man supposed to be integrated into this hierarchy of forces? Says the white man is integrated into this hierarchy of forces as superior to all Africans, because the Africans see that he's better at controlling natural forces, right? So, but he's a bit, it's a bit ambiguous here. Does he mean all living Africans, or all Africans, including, the ancestors and the living, right? It's unclear. But I highlight this because one other critic of Placide Tempels, who unfortunately we cannot read in this workshop, but he's quite famous, Aimé Césaire, will criticize Tempels by saying that, look, there's a clear political issue here, that Tempels is describing this Bantu ontology in a way that's supposed to give Europeans the impression that, they are adored and worshipped by their subjects, right? They occupy this elevated rank in the hierarchy, of forces, of vital forces. And Paulin Hountondji will talk a little bit about Césaire's critique, which is to be found in his discourse on colonialism. But Paulin Hountondji will say that, okay, the political critique, is perhaps legitimate, but it doesn't get to the core of the key methodological issues. Now, one thing, having raised this political problem, one thing to note about Placide Tempels and his life is that Placide Tempels, it would be a bit too simplistic to say that he is sort of always in cahoots with colonial officials. In fact, after the publication of Bantu philosophy, he is expelled from the Belgian Congo. And he doesn't actually get celebrated for writing Bantu philosophy by colonial officials or by the church, right? So some people in the in the church, they read this book and say this is basically heresy. That you're saying that there are these fundamental commonalities between Christianity and the Bantu worldview. They say this, this is heresy. And the colonial officials are also not that happy that he's describing these seemingly primitive people as a people who have a philosophy that's worth considering, and that a people that one should be engaged in conversation with, as opposed to dictating terms to them, right? So he doesn't actually get petted or celebrated by colonial officials, right? So that's something to keep in mind, because it makes the whole situation, I think, in terms of the political reading of this material a bit complicated, I'd say. So Placide Tempels also identifies some laws governing interactions between forces. So he says if we observe their customs, behavior, and so on, we can see that they believe that a human being can directly increase or decrease the vital force of another human being, because these are beings that occupy the same kind of status, same stratum in the hierarchy of vital forces. He also says there is a second law, which is that lower forces or beings can only act on a higher force if they are being used by a being that is equal to that higher force. So to give you a very simple example, he would say, well, look, a rock cannot injure a human being because it occupies a lower position in the hierarchy of vital forces, unless it is being used by another human being to hurt the first human being. Right, and used here in a very expansive sense. It could be in terms of magic, right, and so on. Another law that he describes is that a higher being can exercise influence on everything subordinate to it, and that there is this kind of intimate connection between these things, between the higher being and everything connected to it. And that's supposed to make sense of how people practice sympathetic magic, for example, right? That I can hurt you by hurting something that belongs to you, right? So again, there is this idea that we can get we can identify an anchor to practices by understanding this underlying philosophical discourse. So he also wants to say that the Bantu are the Bantu speakers, or the Luba, to be more particular, more specific, if you will. He wants to say that it's not that these people are oblivious to their natural environment, and in fact, these laws of vital forces are supposed to help them make sense of a phenomenon that they observe every day, namely that in some cases humans are able to defeat nature and bend it to their will, but in other cases they fail. Right, and the idea is that appealing to this hierarchy of vital forces and their interaction is supposed to help them make sense of this data. So he wants to say, look, it's not that, it's not irrational, really. We might think it's wrong as, European Christians, but, it's not, it's not totally untethered from the empirical realm. And here, finally, I want to say something before opening this up for discussion, circling back to Placide Tempels' conception of philosophy, which is that the way Placide Tempels talks about the relationship between philosophy and the natural sciences is interesting, because Placide Tempels seems to think that philosophy is essentially totally independent from the natural sciences. So that nothing that we can find by means of investigations carried out using the methods of the natural sciences can have any bearing on questions of philosophical significance, which are fundamental, if you recall, questions of ontology, And I bring this up because Hountondji will fundamentally disagree with this conception of the relationship between philosophy and the natural sciences. So that's all I had to say in terms of, lecture. And I'd like to open it up for discussion. And of course, if things come up and then maybe I need to talk a bit more, we can do that. But I think we can start with questions that you had about the reading, things that were unclear, and so on, and take it from there. Nicholas, yes.
Hello. So I'm a bit familiar with Levi Brule. I think that's how you pronounce his name. And but I guess between him and Bussy Temples, I guess these are the only two philosophers I've come across who've tried to do this, really try and dig into what they see as the way a different person thinks, and then um, come up with like a wholesale explanation for it. Is there a continuity between them, or do they like what? Why? I mean, it seems like kind of an extraordinary thing to do. It's I can understand it being done on kind of a superficial level, but it stands out in that well, they each in their own way just like say, okay, I'm gonna start from brass tacks. I'm gonna start from the beginning and try and explain this entire mindset of this other people. Are there other people in that? Are there other thinkers, or I guess even like did Levi Brule? Is that somebody that Temples looked to and said, "Oh, I'm gonna try and do what he did"? Or
Yeah, great question. Um, so interestingly, as far as I know, Placide Temples, in at least in the book Bantu Philosophy, never explicitly refers to Levi Brule. He just refers to those who hold that there is an illogical mentality that characterizes the mental life of so-called primitive peoples, which is Levi Brule, right? I mean, but it seems that he has some kind of vague, knowledge of what Levi Brule is up to, because Levi Brule's account is a bit more complex, right? I mean, the reason Levi Brule writes about the primitive mentality, well, one of the reasons, but one of the key reasons, is he wants to give an account of uh, how scientific thinking emerges. And actually, Levi Brule seems to think that scientific thinking is a kind of continuation of common sense, and that once you have a social structure that undermines, he has this notion of participation, which is a kind of totemic thinking. So once you have a social structure that undermines that, scientific discourse can kind of take off on its own, right? So there was a hindering factor. I'm going to describe that mentality. I'm going to describe the social conditions that lead to its termination, and then we have an account of how scientific discourse emerges. So Levi Brule is, he's very different from Placide Tempels in the sense that Levi Brule never actually does any kind of fieldwork. So if you read Levi Brule's books on the primitive mentality, you'll find in the footnotes, I mean, he's tremendously erudite. He's read all of these ethnographic accounts, but he's never really, engaged in any fieldwork himself. He's almost, he's doing kind of what somebody like Emile Durkheim does in the elementary forms of religious life. And actually, they're drawing on some of the same ethnographic material, especially material from Central Australia, written in the 1910s and 20s about totemic religions. Levi Brule, Placide Tempels is different because he purports to be doing fieldwork. I mean, he says, look, I've lived for a couple of decades with these people. I understand them. They recognize that I understand them. And Placide Tempels is also writing in the 40s. Now, the 40s, that's a very interesting time because, of course, you do have European colonies across the African continent. But in the 1940s, especially as a result of World War II, and you'll notice this book is from, the post-World War II period, the immediate post-World War II period. You'll notice that there is a concern in colonial discourse was something that you can call development. Actually, development as a term becomes really key in colonial discourse during this period because now there is a need to justify colonialism. And you can't really appeal to racist discourse anymore explicitly because that's just, brings people back to Nazism. And we've just gotten out of World War II. So you don't really want to do some race science stuff. That's not a good idea. So now there's a claim that we're here for the sake of development. But if you're here for the sake of development, there is a question of, well, how can you educate these people? How can you increase literacy rates? And then there is a question of, well, don't we really have to understand how these people think in order to carry out these social policies, right? So it's all tightly connected in that sense. Lévi-Brul's concerns, they're from an earlier period. He starts, I think, writing about this stuff in the very early, the first decade, I want to say, of the 20th century, and into the 1920s, I want to say. I'm not sure about the dates off the top of my head, right? So it's a different historical context. But Lévi-Brul, very interesting figure too, because he wants to say, well, look, this ethnographic material, especially the material on totemic religions, seems to suggest that these people hold beliefs that don't really make sense in light of classical logic. So they hold, for example, that, so let's say we have a certain group of people X, and their totem is this animal, the emo, or whatever, the kangaroo. And he says the ethnographic discourse on these people seems to be saying that these people hold that they themselves are the animal, but they're also not the animal because they're humans. So that seems to imply contradiction. So we're P, but not P. And he says the way to make sense of this is to recognize that this is a mental outlook that doesn't abide by the classical laws of logic. It abides by something called participation. So the idea is that, we identify with the totem, we participate in the being of the totem. So Lévi-Brul presents his account of a pre-logical mentality as a kind of charitable interpretation of what's being said about these people in the ethnographic discourse. He says they're not, fools. They don't really they don't violate our canons. Well, they do violate our canons, but not because they recognize them and then systematically violate them, but rather they adhere to a different set of canons, right? So that's the kind of direction in which he takes it. But Lévi-Brul, interestingly, in his posthumous notebooks, he recants and says, I give up all I said about the primitive mentality in terms of it being pre-logical. Says there are no pre-logical people. And he seems to hint that actually the right thing to have done in cases where we seem to get accounts where, people are holding that, X is both true and false, is to question whether the ethnographic account is accurate, whether there are problems of translation and so on, before jumping to the claim that we're talking about pre-logical mentality. So I don't know if that, answers your question a little bit, or if you have follow-up questions, Nicholas.
I mean, it's I don't really know Lévi-Brul, and I only read him partially 20 years ago. So it's, I mean, even what you said is very helpful, but also bringing up Durkheim, I think, and you said that they looked at some of the same ethnographies. So maybe in a way, Lévi-Brul was asking questions about methodology that Durkheim took for granted or something. or just this
Right.
sort of
I mean,
occurs to me because in the end he said, oh, you know what, maybe these ethnographers were not even so accurate, um, because he's been thinking it through, and that's what it, and maybe Durkheim took it as given to him. Not that I don't really know Durkheim either. I just like I know a little bit about each. So, but it's interesting that you brought them up and said they kind of looked at the same materials.
right, right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've never done this project, but somebody I think can go and look at the material they studied, because also Freud looks at the same Australian material in Totem and Taboo. I mean, that's I don't want to get too distracted going down that route, but that's something I think that if someone is interested in this issue could investigate. Uh, yeah. So other questions or comments? I mean, it can be on the readings, of course, on things that you think are related to the reading, on what I've said in the lecture part, things that were unclear, require further clarification, and so on.
Yeah, I think I was gonna make some comments, because I think it's really interesting. I think with one of the things that I came from the reading is that I kind of came to this material kind of in a backwards way, where I think the first that I had kind of been presented in the kind of another seminars that I had taken about like early African philosophy. I think that there was a very in that kind of political dimension that you were saying. I think that because, and I'm sure that I think from what you were saying, we're going to get to eventually. I was kind of in a seminar presented that like the beginning of a philosophical kind of vein in African philosophy was kind of through Senghor and Césaire and kind of the negritude. So it is kind of interesting then to kind of come to this material kind of at a political odds, to kind of think also like Senghor's project of African philosophy also being like a project of nation building, like kind of presenting philosophy in a way that it could also like present the building blocks of another structure. Because I think that the thing that I can't escape from this reading is that kind of political dimension of like, oh, this is, this like ethnographic material, anthropological material. It is very hard for me, I guess, from like the political angle that I consume these things from, to kind of divorce them from a colonial project, and then it is kind of interesting to hear that even though this writing and this kind of study kind of exists in this very, very deep colonial missionary matrix, that the people who could have like used it for like exploitation found it heretical, like you were saying. I think that also is really interesting, and I think kind of brings up at odds kind of also like what might be the finality of these kinds of projects, because I think that kind of I'm myself, I'm from the Caribbean and Latin America. I think I'm always really interested in these philosophical debates around kind of like, obviously there's like an interest in philosophy to look at it maybe through this like lens of method and thinking about it as through a science. But there seems to always be these cracks where that kind of shows that we can't really look at it in that way. So I guess what I'm also really interested in is then like how this like how starting a project of African philosophy from this like flawed, weird position of this missionary project also like informs the rest of the reading of how we kind of imagine this history of the science kind of, because that's kind of where I came from when I think the person who, when I was studying it from Senghor, there was a very political reason to be like, no, it has to start from a project of nation building. It has to start from a place that doesn't kind of look at this like project from a lack of philosophical also like material. Because I think also the thing that I guess also like just kind of thinking a lot about the comments is like if a lot of these like European philosophers come to the continent and say like, oh, there isn't material to think about philosophy outside of the oral record, it is interesting then to look at Senghor and then Senghor being like, oh, well, we can look at art. You know, we can look at a real, actual physical material that we don't relate necessarily as philosophical record, but there is kind of, I guess, an interesting project in Senghor to look at them to not just say like, oh, like it's just oral tradition and we have to do this weird semiotic like exercise of like you were saying, right? There's a weird thing of almost like semiotic psychoanalysis, language analysis of kind of distilling philosophy from just the oral and kind of also presenting, I guess, this also like really weird kind of like consistent thing of if there's an oral tradition, it also lacks in a certain way. Like if the oral tradition was like the primitive format of information, and you know we have a privileged format, which is the format that lets us kind of position it as historical and as existing in a canon and as existing in debates. But I guess I'm also interested then too. Like I don't know if he ever kind of speaks on it on like why the focus on language. You know, like why was that the chosen medium to think through these things? I guess that also like just to add to kind of like the jumble of things I'm thinking about. It also kind of what made me think too is like a lot of the syncretic religions in the New World, kind of in the Caribbean and in South America, a lot of like Santeria, Voodoo, las divisiones, a lot of those like practices are thought of through the Yoruba languages. You know, even there's a lot of places over here in the Caribbean where we talk about African religion and African philosophy through this religiosity of the Yoruba practices. So I guess there also seems something interesting there in that exercise of language and the oral as being the recipient of philosophy. But I guess there's also like a debate, I guess, of is it seen as an inferior canon because of its immateriality? How can we think of like the materiality of the oral?
Yeah, these are all great points, Luis. Thank you. So these comments, they look ahead to some of the questions and critical responses that will be made by Paulin Hountondji to ethnophilosophical discourses. So, for example, Paulin Hountondji will directly raise this question of writing. And he will ask, you know, whether writing is a necessary condition for there to be something that we can recognize as philosophy. I mean, his answer is to say that writing is probably a necessary condition for the flourishing of a philosophical discourse, which maybe is a bit different from saying that it's necessary for it to exist, right? Because, you know, it could be the case that it's not necessary for it to exist, but it's necessary for it to develop in a certain way at a certain pace. And we'll look at the reasons he provides for that claim. But one interesting thing regarding the political dimension is that Hountondji thinks that Senghor is too uncritical of what's going on here in the case of ethnophilosophical discourse. I mean, Hountondji doesn't really target Senghor in an explicit way, in the same way that somebody like Frantz Fanon does, but you know, he's one of his targets. And Paulin Hountondji will relate what Leopold Senghor says about African philosophy to Leopold Senghor's discourse of African socialism, which very importantly makes the strong claim that there were no classes in what Senghor would describe as traditional African societies, or class was not a salient element of social organization. And Paulin Hountondji will say, well, look, even if that's the case historically, which he doesn't think it's the case historically, but even if it is, it's very dangerous to talk about, a traditional classless society on the eve of independence, where you have, obvious class differentiation and so on, right? So that political component will come from that angle. Now, Placide Tempels himself is not really talking about classless societies, but he does seem to talk about societies that are fairly simple in a social sense, right? They don't have a lot of differentiation, and presumably there is a link between that and unanimity. But there is a question that Paulin Hountondji will raise regarding that, and he would say, well, look, one thing is to note that the direction in which ethnophilosophical discourse seems to take us is a direction in which we are primarily talking about cultural authenticity. And Hountondji thinks that this is fine, but it's not the main line of discourse that should be dominant, because he thinks that this is a way in which we can avoid talking about actual economic dependence in these newly independent African countries, right? And Paulin Hountondji himself, to think about this biographically, right? So Paulin Hountondji, he studies in Paris, he comes back and he works, actually, he doesn't work first in his native Benin. He goes to the Congo, which is under Mobutu's rule at that time. So I think Paulin Hountondji is teaching at the University of Kinshasa. And Mobutu is a very interesting case, right? Because Mobutu was someone who really used this discourse of cultural authenticity, right? He changes the country's name to Zaire. He encourages people to abandon French names and so on. People can check this out on YouTube, right? He wears the leopard cloth over his shoulder, right? But at the same time, and Mobutu was somebody who was deeply enmeshed in this American imperialist project. He provided aid to apartheid South Africa. So he was deeply enmeshed in all of these projects. And the things that Paulin Hountondji writes about the dangers of discussions or fixations on cultural authenticity in the political sphere are partially explained in biographical terms as a result of this experience, where he saw it being abused in this way, right? So that's something to keep in mind. Now, interestingly, as far as I can tell, Paulin Hountondji will not take up the very interesting point you made about art, which Senghor makes, and which Sulaiman Bashir Dian in his book on Senghor emphasizes, right? So African art, yes, exactly. So Paulin Hountondji doesn't have much to say about that, but that would be an interesting angle to look at this material. And I think it's a perspective worth carrying forward as we get to the readings from Paulin Hountondji himself. But you mentioned Senghor, the other key proponent of African socialism, Kwame Nkrumah. I mean, Nkrumah is a bit tricky because later on, after the coup d'etat that removes him from office in 1966, Nkrumah seems to repudiate some aspects of African socialism. So the claim that African societies are traditionally classless, or that the claim that also contemporary, as in post-independence African societies are societies where class is not a salient social element. He will explicitly repudiate that. So Nkrumah changes his mind, but Paulin Hountondji will also give us an account of what's happening in terms of how Nkrumah changes his mind and how Nkrumah thinks about the role of African philosophy in the political sphere. Yeah, so these are all good things to keep in mind. I mean, we started out reading Placide Temples because he provides the kind of paradigm. And Leopold Sedar Senghor himself celebrates Placide Temples. He says this book is, it's fantastic and so on. He cites it in some places, and it's clear he refers to this vital forces ontology in some of his own writings. So it's a work that has really important uh, 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 influences and effects on subsequent African philosophical discourse.
See, I think it's Senghor, because of the French, I think it's the Elan Vivre, right? He kind of
Yes,
he turns it
yes.
into French. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Placide Temples is Bantu philosophy primarily. I mean, it's originally written in Flemish, in Dutch, basically, right? But it circulates primarily in French, right? And Présence Africaine, they publish the French translation of it. Good. Any follow-up questions, comments?
I was just wondering if I probably we're informed when we read the first pages of the temples, but the artworks that are interspersed in the text, are those temples' choice? Are those a later choice? I mean, it's a later edition, I guess, that we're reading. So
Yeah, my understanding is that this is the choice of the editorial house at Présence Africaine, which Senghor was, a part of that circle. I mean, I wonder. I mean, I don't really know who picked these art pieces, but I don't think it's Stemples. But that would be then a really interesting connection in relation to what Luis was saying about Senghor and on sculpture, particularly, right? Plastic arts. Now, one interesting thing to note about all of this, of course, is that there is a current of ethno-philosophical discourse that says, okay, what Placide Tempels is saying about Bantu philosophy, that's a bit suspect because, he's making these claims about speakers of all Bantu languages. We're going to be more specific in our discourse. So you'll have people who are talking about Yoruba philosophy. You'll have people who are talking about Hausa philosophy, right? So there is an attempt to narrow the scope as a result of criticisms about tendencies to overgeneralize. And of course, people still write this way, right? So it's not as if, this is a way of doing African philosophy that has died out. I mean, you can probably tell cards on the table. I'm not the biggest fan of this way of doing African philosophy, but this workshop is not about indoctrination or anything. I'm going to be presenting uh, uh, ethno-philosophical discourse, and of course, it's the people who have critically responded to it. But there is contemporary stuff. I mean, I didn't include it, but again, if people want to examine some of that material, I'd be happy to put some of that up through the Google Drive for this class. Other questions or comments? Maybe from the people who are hiding behind their closed cameras. So we don't want to monopolize the discussion. Okay, Laila wants the. Okay, yeah. So I'll put this up as suggested readings or extra readings. And I put up a copy of my book on Paulin Hountondji where I cite some of them. So that's also a good way to find some of them. but I'll also upload some other material in PDF form. So one thing I wanted to mention about Placide temples is that some of the critical responses to temples who really take issue with his description of what he calls Bantu religion in monotheistic terms, because there will be responses that say, well, look, the reason that Placide Temple says that is not because these people are really, they're monotheistic in any way, but that because he thinks that he's kind of doing them a favor by describing them as monotheists, as lapsed monotheists, if you will. But of course, there are people who say, well, look, if you're not a Christian and you're not committed to monotheism, maybe you look at this material in a different light and say, well, look, no, they're polytheists. That's fine. We're not really committed to the claim that there's a hierarchy of religions where monotheism is kind of the most advanced form of religion. So that's something to also think about in relation to discussions in African philosophy of religion, how much emphasis people put on the monotheistic aspect and the extent to which people dissent from that view, really. Because Placide Temples takes it for granted that when he describes them as monotheists who have degenerated in their monotheism, if you will, that this is a charitable account. This is an account that's meant to counter the image of these people as primitive peoples without advanced religion, or even without any religion in some colonialist discourse. But that's a questionable claim. I mean, I bring this up because that's not something that we're going to be looking at not in this workshop, because Paulin Hountondji himself doesn't really care very much for this issue. But it is an issue that's worth highlighting, I believe. And of course, there are responses. So responses to Placide Temples that question this dichotomy that he draws between what he calls a static conception of being, static conception of being in Western philosophy, and a dynamic conception of being that's supposed to characterize Bantu philosophy, because some people will point out that, of course, there are cases where you could redescribe the static conception of being in dynamic terms, right? So if you talk about, a potentiality, so in Aristotelian terms, for example, a potentiality that a substance has, which then becomes actual, right? So that's a dynamic process, right? So these substances have potential, and under certain conditions, this potential or potentiality is actualized. So you could say, well, look, this is still a dynamic account of reality, and maybe Placide Temples is overdrawing that distinction between the static and the dynamic. So the person who talks in these terms is the Rwandan philosopher Alexis Kagame, who tries to take on some elements of Placide Temples' project, but restricts it to the study of Kenya, Rwanda, so to the study of a particular language. And he actually challenges the notion that all speakers of Bantu languages have this dynamic conception of being, right? So that's a way in which Placide Temples was challenged again by people who found something useful in his project, but believed it also had some significant shortcomings that ought to be overcome. And so I'll also say something about the secondary literature. So if you look at the syllabus, so the Mattolino reading, which I have, I think it's the first one in the secondary literature, just for further study. So this is a good, I think, account of what the people who are really critical of Placide Tempels make of his legacy in African philosophy. So they think it's a kind of, well, it's a negative legacy. I mean, you can see it in the title, this notion that Placide Tempels really try to separate African philosophy from global philosophical discourse by presenting it as something totally radically different. And now that's interesting, right? Because it's an interesting move to make. So you'll see, I think, and I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but you'll see that there are two responses in general to colonial discourse. So there's a response that says the problem with colonialist discourse, which I mean, it's a heterogeneous discourse. So but we're going to simplify for the sake of this exposition. So some people will say the fundamental problem with colonial discourse is that it attempted to impose uniformity or homogeneity on different peoples, right? It didn't recognize their specific differences from Europeans. But then there are those who maintain that the problem with colonial discourse is that it attempted to overemphasize differences between different peoples. And probably these different characterizations of colonialist discourse stem from people taking different cases of colonialism as their paradigmatic case. So you'll see for the most part, let's say if you're taking French assimilationist colonial discourse with its emphasis on the possibility of assimilation into the French Empire and so on, right? You might think of, okay, so what colonialism is doing here is it's encouraging people to give up these cultural differences and so on. But for the most part, one could say that, and this is, controversial, but this is my own take on this, but just putting my cards on the table. For the most part, at least I think for the African continent, from the late 19th century up to the 1930s and 40s, I would say that most colonialist discourse really try to emphasize fundamental differences between African peoples and non-African peoples, that these people think radically differently, they have a different standard of living and so on. And now, if you think that what's happening with colonialist discourse is an overemphasis on differences, then you might be very suspicious of someone like Placide Tempels, who comes and says, look, these people, they think in a totally different way. So you might think that this is a bit suspicious, right? And I would say that Paulin Hountondji is somebody who is in the camp of people who think that the problem with colonialist discourse is that it really tried to treat Africans as these radically different beings, and so radically different that they were inferior, right? And therefore, he's very suspicious when someone comes and says there is this very different African philosophical worldview. He's very wary of this, right? So I think the response to Placide Tempels is probably a function of how people think of colonialism, right? So if you think about it differently, you might take a different route. Because of course you could say, well, look, the civilizing mission was an important part of colonialist discourse. But in truth, the civilizing mission, especially at least in the Anglophone sphere, but I would say even in the Francophone sphere with respect to French colonies, despite the assimilationist discourse and all of that, the civilizing mission was really a guiding principle of colonialism at the level of ideological discourse up until the 1840s. So actually, before the scramble of Africa, it had been discarded for a variety of reasons. One fundamental reason, especially in the British case, is what they took to be the failure of the civilizing mission in India. So, of course, the British have a lot more experience of being imperial overlords in India than they do in Africa. And the rebellion in the mid-19th century really makes them think that, look, the problem is we try to impose our culture on the Indians. We shouldn't do that. We should leave them as they are. And this gave birth to the doctrine of indirect rule. So the doctrine of indirect rule basically said, look, we try to preserve the social structures as much as we can. We don't try to directly deal with the people we're ruling. We're dealing with them through intermediaries. So whether they be chiefs or feudal lords or, whatever. So that's also say, when we're talking about the political context, of course, it's contentious how to describe that political context. And we can have, of course, competing accounts. We can have a discussion based on that. And you'll see, of course, that there are different historical experiences with colonialism. So, Luis, you brought up the Latin American and Caribbean context, which is a very different context, of course, because there you had the primary form of colonialism was a settler colonial form. On the African continent, attempts to create settler colonies were the most part totally unsuccessful, with the partial exception of South Africa, right? But French settler colonialism in Algeria failed completely. Attempts to create a settler colony in the highlands of Kenya also failed completely. Right, so it's a bit of a different experience. And one thing to note, so if we're talking about the Belgian Congo, which is, where Place Temples is working, most Congolese would never have seen a Belgian official, a white Belgian official in their life under colonialism. So it was a very different experience in terms of, who people are taking orders from. Most of the time, people are taking orders from chiefs, who are in turn taking orders from colonial officials. But there's this chain, and people are not really interacting directly with colonial officials. And therefore, when you look at the number of colonial officials in colonies, say whether British, French, or Belgian in West and Central Africa, you'll see that I think Nigeria, what is today Nigeria, for example, had only a couple of thousand British officials for a massive population. So it was a very different experience in terms of the extent to which people came into contact with colonial officials. So these are all things to just keep in mind, right, when we're thinking about what's happening here. And of course, one fundamental thing to keep in mind is that Placide Tempels gives this very important role to philosophy in explaining human behavior, as we've seen, right? He says, look, you explain human behavior by positing an implicit philosophical system that these people adhere to. Now, Paulin Hountondji, I described him as a Kantian, which he is, but he's also a Marxist. And he thinks that from a historical materialist standpoint, claiming that philosophical convictions, implicit philosophical convictions, are what fundamentally explain human behavior and human social structures, he thinks that this is fundamentally misguided. Right? So I think there is, again, a clash here at the level of basic competing conceptions of social and historical explanation. So Paulin Hountondji plays this very odd role of a philosopher who thinks that other philosophers have overstated the causal powers of philosophy. right? So Paulin Hountondji is a professional philosopher, spends all of his life as a professional philosopher. I mean, he died, I want to say last year or maybe 2 years ago, so fairly recently. But he always had this view that a lot of discourse on African philosophy seems to be overstating the importance of philosophy in general. So it's a bit of an odd position that he occupies as a professional philosopher who thinks that he has to constantly remind people that philosophy is important, but not as important as they think. Which sometimes makes, for amusing reading, so to speak. So I just want to stop here because we have half an hour left, and I just want to see if people had questions or comments. So the readings, for the most part, are about 40 pages in length each week. Sometimes it's going to be denser than that, but I've kept it around 40, maximum 50 pages a week, and I've highlighted the required readings, the suggested readings, and then some helpful secondary literature. I'll add more to that secondary literature. But basically, anything that's not highlighted as required is not, it's not something that I expect you to read. And of course, I'm happy to talk about material that we haven't directly read. If people want to bring their own interests, of course, to the discussion. The only thing I'll ask you is, of course, in many cases, you'll have a lot more expertise in the material that you're interested in than I will. So, I'll just ask you to explain it so that all of us understand, and, are on the same footing. But in principle, I'm totally fine with that. And in general, I would really encourage you while you're reading to take notes and, write down questions that you have. Usually, I will lecture in the beginning for a little bit, maybe an hour, maybe a bit more than that. But then I would really like to open it up for discussion. I think it makes for a much more dynamic experience. And frankly, I really don't want to bore you by droning on for 2.5 hours. I think you don't really get as much out of that experience as a more active engagement. So with that in mind, happy to field questions. Also, if people that want to write down their questions in the chat, if you're in a place where it's hard to unmute yourself, that's fine for me. Okay, that's an invitation for me to drone on, so I'm going to do it. So one other thing to highlight is I mentioned that there is also a fundamental disagreement between Paulin Hountondji and Placide Tempels when it comes to understanding or conceptualizing the relationship between philosophy and the natural sciences. Placide Tempels says, philosophy is metaphysics. That's totally independent of the natural sciences. It doesn't, the natural sciences, what they discover or don't discover, doesn't have a bearing on what we say there. Paulin Hountondji, by contrast, I describe them as a Kantian. So that means two things. So he's very suspicious of this notion that metaphysics is first philosophy or is the core of philosophy. But it also means something else in terms of kind of a neo-Kantian approach to philosophy. It means that he believes that philosophy is a kind of second-order discourse or theory on first-order scientific discourse. That philosophy fundamentally has to be a theory of science, has to be an account of science, of how science works, of what science can tell us, and of how science progresses, right? So, and science here taken in a broad sense, he'll talk about the natural sciences, he'll talk about the social sciences, but his paradigmatic cases are the natural sciences. So, for example, he will say things such as, we can't really understand early modern European philosophy without understanding the early modern scientific revolution, that people like Descartes and so on are responding and participating in this early modern scientific revolution. So he has a totally different conception of the relationship between philosophy and science. And you'll see that Paulin Hountondji, one of the things he says when he takes objection to people overvaluing or overestimating the significance of philosophy, is that he will say, well, look, given that philosophy is the second order discourse on first order scientific discourse, what African societies really need in this moment, so he's writing in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, is they need scientific discourse. Before we can start talking about the second order philosophical discourse, we really need to encourage the institutionalization of the natural sciences on the African continent, because he thinks that this has not sufficiently taken place, and it was not encouraged by colonialism. It was also not pursued in the post-independence period. So there are lots of moving parts here, but I just wanted to put that on the table as well to keep it, for you to keep it in mind as you start reading Paulin Hountondji in preparation for our next session. And having highlighted this idea of philosophy as a theory of science, that will also enable us to think about what Paulin Hountondji will say about literacy. Because one way to approach this is, of course, to talk about the relationship between literacy and philosophy in a direct manner. The other way to approach this is to take an indirect approach and talk about the relationship between literacy and science, specifically the natural sciences, and then approach the question of philosophy from that direction, if you will.
I think the only thing to add to that kind of, it seems really interesting is, I mean, I think maybe some other people here were on that seminar too, but I just recently finished up a seminar kind of looking at the history of kind of philosophical debate in Latin America. So it really is interesting kind of in the way that you were mentioning before, kind of the different ways that like the colonial relation to these kind of epistemologies developed. It really is interesting because I think one of the kind of big main debates that kind of came up in the seminar around Latin American kind of philosophical debate is this thing that you were saying, that like we kind of came out of the seminars kind of discussing of like, oh, maybe this decolonial philosophical debate in Latin America is over representing how much effect philosophical discourse can have on real world political colonial like structure. But then it is interesting then to see kind of the development of these philosophical arguments in Africa being kind of like on another side of the debate, where it's like, no, they need to exist in front of social political reality, and they need to relate to these things, because philosophy isn't the thing that will fix the thing at the end. I think that I guess because of that thing you were saying of like the different colonial structures coming from the Latin American and Caribbean kind of camp of these colonial discussions, there really, really, really is a big onus on how like how the settler colonialism depended on epistemology, and how it depended on this philosophy that came over, this Western thinking. But then it is kind of interesting to kind of you say like, oh yeah, well then the debate happens differently in the African context, when it wasn't really like an intellectual class or it wasn't really ever like discussions about how to like westernize Africa. It was more about like how Africa is managed hierarchically in like a structure of power and who's running the ship, to say so, you know.
Right, right. Yeah, I think that's something to keep in mind, that these are yeah, different historical contexts. And of course, I mean, in the Latin American case, especially in, the societies where the settlers came to be dominant. So, if you're thinking like Argentina or Uruguay or something, there is, of course, a kind of natural direct identification with the West that doesn't happen in the African context, right? So even if there is an African elite that came to identify with French high culture or Portuguese literature or so on, there's still a basic sense in which this total identification could not take place, right? Because it was overlaid, obviously, with a very clearly racist discourse based on, physical features and so on, uh, that constituted, I think, an obstacle to this total identification. Yeah, so these are very interesting comparisons, and I'm happy, to entertain them in the workshop as we go along. I haven't worked on Latin American philosophy myself, but I have a kind of amateur interest in these discussions. So happy to keep that discussion in mind. And of course, I mean, there is an interesting debate right now in African philosophy, since decolonial, what came to be called decolonial philosophy, especially as expressed in the writings of people like Walter Mignolo and so on, has come to be taken up by African philosophers today. Right. So some people point to, maybe differences in context, to say, well, actually, you can't just import this whole discussion wholesale. There are modifications that have to be made and so on. But that's, of course, not to say that there wasn't an assimilationist discourse on the African continent for some periods of time, especially in the 1940s, because there is this discourse of development and so on. But it was only ever very, very limited in its geographical scope, really. Primarily, it was centered on the urban centers and so on. It did not, for the most part, for example, extend to the peasantry, and that's where I think things become interestingly different. Any other comments or questions? Okay, I think if there are no further comments or questions, we can wrap up a bit early for this session. Yeah, Nicholas, go ahead.
Do we need to sign up for like text presentations, or is that
Yes.
is that something that okay.
No, that's something. So my understanding is we're going to be sending out emails regarding that, but our coordinator can also chime in.
Yes, there would be a spreadsheet, I think, or something like that, with the signing up for presentations. As usual, it goes in the news engine.
And we'll start the next session doing introductions and so on. So we'll get to know everyone in the seminar. We'll ask people to introduce themselves. I'll also say a bit more about myself. Yeah. Sorry, there is something in the comments. Okay, so Laura's asking, so I'm just going to read this out loud. So I just found interesting that Temples uses magic as an umbrella category that seems to contain a lot of things, yet simultaneously it is a distinction between magic. There is a distinction between magic and this force or vital energy. I wanted to ask how this happened. Yeah, so that's a really good question. So in that discussion, so Placide Tempels knows that, of course, there is a discussion of magical practices amongst so-called primitive peoples in the ethnographic literature in the first half of the 20th century, right? So he recognizes that that takes place. But he wants to say that this discussion of magic is very superficial because it doesn't really understand that these practices are based on this vital force ontology, right? So he wants to say that, so take something like sympathetic magic, or take, magical practices, for example, that involve hurting someone by hurting a physical representation of them. Right, so I get, some doll or mannequin that's supposed to represent you. I poke its eye. This is supposed to hurt your physical eye, your real physical eye. And he says you have to understand this in terms of the ontology of vital forces and the kind of impression that is made by beings with higher energy on things of on things that belong to them. So you'll see in a lot of these magical practices, it's not just a representation of you, but something from you has to be there, right? So maybe some of your hair, whatever, something like that, depending on the magical practice. And the idea is that actually that part of the person you're trying to hurt that you've taken, so like clippings from their hair or nail clippings, whatever. I don't really know the details, but you take that, and that's supposed to then maintain a link between this being you're trying to hurt, so another human being, right, who occupies a fairly high status in this hierarchy of vital forces. So it maintains that link, and then through maintaining that link, you can then try to hurt them as a being also of supposedly equal force, right? Because you're also another human being. So basically, he's trying to describe these magical practices in terms of the ontology of vital forces. He thinks that this is really fundamentally what's going on, because then he wants to say that this is not totally weird or anything. It makes sense once you recognize this as based on the laws of interactions that govern this hierarchical order of vital forces. So that's I think his key claim, that this is not really irrational at all. It's not very bizarre or anything. It's simply a case of applying these laws and applying these background assumption about the kind of beings that exist in the universe and the relationship to one another. So he thinks that to talk about it as magic is to essentially not give it its due, right? To just talk about it as magic is to maybe denigrate it and not recognize that it expresses an ontological view that's coherent, that's systematic. I don't know, Laura, if that answers your question. If you can, okay, yeah, good. Other comments or questions? Okay, in that case, we'll wrap up 12 minutes early, and I'll see you next week. So same time, 2 p.m. next Friday, where we get to the meat of this workshop. Really, we go to the core of it and discuss Paulin Hountondji and specifically his first book, African Philosophy, Myth and Reality. All right, thank you, everyone.